All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got chapter 27, section 5, The Great Powers of Europe, 1871 to 1900. So in this particular section, it's sort of laying out kind of like the pre-World War I Europe. World War I breaks out in 1914. And so this chapter is just, or this section of this chapter is just kind of looking a little bit at the status of all of the nations in Europe leading up to that conflict. At the center of it is Germany, which, recall, became a country. We talked about this in a previous chapter. Became a country in 1871. So we might say about Germany, Germany is a new country, right? It's a new country. And to make things worse, it's very powerful. Well, I guess make things worse for the other powers surrounding Germany. To make things better for Germany itself, they're very powerful in terms of their military, in terms of technology, in terms of industry. Germany becomes the world leader. We'll also say economy. You know, Germany is on its way to becoming the world leader in a number of these very different categories. Now, the person responsible for German unification was Otto von Bismarck. He was the prime minister of Prussia, a German state that helped kind of create and get all the other German states to join them to create the modern state of Germany. And after German unification, he really did a lot to create a sort of stable system. A couple of things he did was to create alliances with countries like Austria and Russia. So this helped to isolate who was historically the European continent's most powerful state, and that was France. So this was a way, again, for at least Germany to create some sort of stability there and to pass sort of various social legislation, which create, and what we mean by this social legislation, we might say that this is something like welfare. Some of the very first welfare programs, in fact, in the world were created by Bismarck in Germany. We might consider something like old age pensions to be part of this, like retirements. And so these things together in trying to create an international system in which Germany had allies, in which France was isolated. This created, and even within Germany itself, with popular social legislation, to again kind of get rid of any maybe internal rebellions, this created a very stable state. And in fact, in the immediate years after 1871, Europe was, relatively stable, at least Germany was. However, this changed with Kaiser Wilhelm. If you're not familiar, Kaiser, that is the German word for emperor. Kaiser Wilhelm II was young. He was brash. He was himself maybe the opposite of stable, right? He was an unstable ruler, you might say, and he fired Bismarck. And rather than pursuing this policy of stability, instead, Kaiser Wilhelm II, that Germany deserved what he called a place in the sun. And what that meant was that Germany deserves, or wants in the very least, a colonial empire. And by pursuing these two things, colonial empire, which meant that Germany needed one, obviously the colonies themselves. So that would create competition between other countries for various territories overseas. Think about new imperialism, but also needed a navy to pursue it. And this was a policy, pursuing a colonial empire. This was a policy that, really sort of axed this kind of stability that Europe experienced. And we can kind of see where we're, kind of headed down a very disastrous road here. Meanwhile, for the other liberal powers, by liberal, again, we want to think about 19th century liberalism and conservatism. Liberalism would just be like pro-democratic. Great Britain with a parliament. France, feeling some of the effects of the French Revolution. We might compare the conservative. Actually, I don't have to write it here. The conservative powers would be Russia and Austria-Hungary, which were much less kind of like the liberal tradition. For France, they've experienced a setback. The Franco-Prussian War in 1871 was the war in which France lost. And so for France, they're kind of knocked down a peg, right? We'll say that they're now second place in Europe. Germany is, where's Germany up here? We'll say Germany right here. Germany is in, we'll say first place now. For Great Britain, they have a couple of problems of their own. On the one hand, a lot of tension with Ireland. We might say Irish resentment towards Britain. We might also say that this was one way that, for example, nationalism played against the British in this case, the Irish demanding their independence. And when it came to the actual affairs of the continent, the British, more or less followed a policy of splendid isolation. Now, we shouldn't read too much into this, because a splendid isolation, again, just refers to isolation from Europe and really kind of European affairs, not the world. Remember, Great Britain still has the largest colonial empire. The British still control India. They still control parts of Africa. They control parts of Asia. So it's isolated in a sense from kind of the greater political affairs of the European continents. Meanwhile, the conservative powers, and by conservative, again, we mean like pro-monarchy, right, in favor of the king. Both Russia and Austria-Hungary are countries which still have very strong rulers in the emperor in Austria and the czar in Russia. And in the conservative states, nationalism played, and we talked about this previously, played a dividing role. This was especially the case in Austria-Hungary. There were many people in Austria-Hungary that were Slavic, right, Eastern European. Austrians tended to be more German, and so a lot of people, especially Slavic nationalism, wanting to have an independent Eastern European Greek Orthodox state, break free from Austria. This was a problem that the Austrians constantly had to deal with. In Russia, it was the same thing. There were many other smaller ethnic groups. Jews, for example, were very numerous in Russia. A lot of other groups like Poles and Lithuanians and Ukrainians. Some of this manifested into very violent mob behavior. Pogroms are, we'll just call this, maybe violent mob. We'll just call it action. I don't really know how to describe it, but essentially it was, Jewish populations in Russia were the targets of violence. And this was actually part of the reason why many immigrated away from Russia. So you can see that at least in the case of Russia, that the minority ethnic populations created some internal divisions that did lead to violence. Now, Russia, there were efforts by some of the czars to reform. Alexander II, again, he was a czar. A czar is a Russian ruler, did emancipate the serfs in the 1860s. This would be considered a liberal sort of piece of legislation. But Alexander II was assassinated by radicals, and his assassination led to a more conservative backlash by successive czars, including that of Nicholas II, who is the Russian czar during World War I. Now, Russia's sort of diminished status is made very apparent in the Russo-Japanese War 1904-1905. This war, Russia and Japan, this was a Japanese victory. And the Japanese victory in this war was an utter disaster for Russia because they were at least perceived as being one of the great powers of the world. The Russians were the ones who put an end to Napoleon, and the Russians were considered to be European. They were considered to be white. And in this era of social Darwinism, it was unthinkable for a European nation to be defeated by an Asian nation in the course of Japan. This ultimately forced Japanese rulers to put forward some reforms. The Duma was the first legislative body in Russian history. However, it really didn't, not the emperor, we want to say the Tsar. The Tsar retained power. So at least you could see that some of the demands of the Russian population were appeased by the creation of the Duma, but even on the verge of World War I, it is still Tsar Nicholas II who holds mostly absolutist rule there.